All right, guys, so today's lesson is over the last form. We're going to learn how to solve specific quadratic equations. And in this situation, it is something called the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is something that you guys will use for honestly probably the rest of your math career. It'll come up over and over again. It's basically a formula that can solve any quadratic you can think of. So no matter what the quadratic looks like or anything like that, you can always solve your quadratic using the quadratic formula. It's like the go-to. It will work no matter what. Okay, so before I tell you what the quadratic formula is, we need to kind of review something. You need to remember the standard form of a quadratic, because we're going to be using these parts in the quadratic formula. So if you remember, the standard form looks like ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are all some integer. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to show you what the quadratic formula looks like. So the quadratic formula is going to be negative b. Okay, so you're going to take whatever's in front of x plus or minus the square root. And the reason it's plus or minus because one, when you have a quadratic, you should always have two answers. And secondly, it's a square root. So it's plus or minus b squared. So whatever b is, you square it, minus 4. That's just a number, times your a value times your c value. And then that whole entire thing, so this whole part is all over 2 times whatever a is. Okay, that is called the quadratic formula. I know right now it might look kind of weird because it's just a bunch of letters, right? There's no numbers right now. There's a few numbers, but it looks kind of different. Here in a second, we're doing examples so you can see what happens and what it means. But again, what you have to remember is these letters. So the B's, the A's, and the C's come from the standard form. So quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, this is something that if I were you at some point in your math career, you will want to memorize because like I said, you will use it over and over again. I learned it in 8th grade and I have not forgotten it since. It is something that does not go away. Okay, so that is the quadratic formula. And again, what's nice about the quadratic formula is it works for any quadratic that you are trying to solve. So let's take a look at example 1. Using the quadratic formula up here, we're going to go through example 1. Example 1 is we want to find the roots of 2m squared plus 2m minus 12 equals 0. Key thing here, guys, in order to solve any quadratic, it's always got to equal 0. So make sure it's always equaling 0. Since this one's already equaling 0, we're good to go. So we want to use our quadratic formula, which looks like this: negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And I just got that from right above. Something that might help you guys to the side, maybe write out what each part is. So if you write to the side here, you know your a value is whatever's in front of the squared, whatever variable squared is. So here our a value is 2. Your b value is whatever's in front of just the variable to the first power, so that would be 2 as well. And then your c is always the last number, the constant. So your c is negative 12. So maybe writing that to the side, you now just take these 3 parts and you're going to plug it in. So basically, when you do that, when you take your negative b, well, b is 2. So you're going to take negative 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared. Well, b is 2, so we're going to take 2 squared minus 4 times your a value, which is 2, times your C value, which is negative 12. And then the whole thing is being divided by 2 times your A value, which is 2 here as well. So what I did was I took the quadratic formula, I took my A, B, and C values, and I put them into the quadratic formula. I just plugged it in. So now at this point, what we're doing is we're solving, okay? Remember, when you're solving these, you have to follow order of operations. That is the biggest problem. The biggest problem that happens with these problems, guys, is getting to this point and solving it correctly. So you have to follow order of operations. So the first thing you want to do is you want to do the part inside the square root. So you can't do anything until you have done this b squared minus 4ac. And again, when you're doing that, make sure you're following order of operations. So I'm going to keep this negative 2 plus or minus part, but now inside my square root, I know that 2 squared is 4 minus a 4 times a 2 times a negative 12 gives you a negative 96. Okay, and that's still all over 2 times 2, which you could go ahead and write that as 4. That's fine. Okay, so now we have inside our square root of 4 minus a negative 96. So we can go ahead and solve that. So I'm going to do it underneath here. So negative 2 plus or minus 4 minus a negative 96 is 100 all over 4. Okay. And now we can take the square root of 100 because we know the square root of 100 is 10. So this now becomes negative 2 plus or minus square root of 100 is 10 all over 4. Now the last step is to get our two roots, right? We have a negative 2 plus 10 over 4 and a negative 2 minus 10 over 4. So I'm going to write each of those out. So our two roots are going to be a negative 2 plus 10 over 4 and negative 2 minus 10 over 4. So here, negative 2 plus 10 is 8 divided by 4. That's a 2. So the first root is 2. And then over here, negative 2 minus 10 is a negative 12 over 4. Negative 12 divided by 4 is negative 3. There's your other root. So your two roots, so your answers here are going to be 2 and negative 3. And that is the quadratic formula, okay? So, again, once you have the quadratic formula, you're just getting the parts of your equation and you're plugging it in. The big part is make sure you are solving it correctly. That is the biggest part here. So I'm going to go ahead and do one more example with you, and then you can go on and do your Canvas check for today. So let's do one more example using the quadratic formula. So this example is going to be the following. So example 2, we are going to solve the quadratic equation of 2x squared minus 3x minus 15 equals 5. So we're going to solve the following. And again, we want to use quadratic formula. But before we do that, remember I told you before you can solve any quadratic, it has to equal something specific. It has to equal 0. Well, 5 is definitely not 0. So we need to make this 0. In order to do that, you want to take this 5 and get it to the other side. So in order to get it to the other side, we're going to subtract it from both sides because now that becomes 0. So your new equation is actually 2x squared minus 3x minus 20 equals 0. So make sure you do that or you're not going to be getting the right A, B, and C values. So this is actually what we're solving here. So again, maybe go ahead and write out your A, B, and C values to help you with your quadratic formula. Your A value here is 2. It's whatever's in front of x squared. B value is a negative 3 this time. and then your C value is a negative 20. And we know the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so we're going to use the different parts of our equation now and the quadratic formula to find our two roots. So when we do that, when we plug in our different parts, the b value is negative 3. And see how it says minus 3? That means we're taking the opposite of 3, of the opposite of b, sorry. So instead of it being a negative 3, it's not going to be a positive 3 because we're taking the opposite. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 20. All over 2 times a, which a is 2 again. So now again, start with inside the square root. You always, 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 always have to start within the square root. So you start with the exponent, and then you can multiply those together. So what you end up with is 3 plus or minus the square root. Negative 3 squared is 9, minus a 4 times 2 times negative 20 is a negative 160. All over, you can go ahead and put 2 times 2, which is 4. So now we need to take care of what's inside that square root, right? So we've got a 9 minus a negative 160. Well, that becomes 3 plus or minus the square root of 169 all over 4. Okay? Now we can take the square root of 169, and the square root of 169 is 13. So we've got 3 plus or minus 13 equals 4. So now you can get your two roots. Your two roots are going to be 3 plus 13 over 4 and 3 minus 13 over 4. 3 plus 13 is 16 divided by 4. So this root is 16 divided by 4, which is 4. And then over here, 3 minus 13 is a negative 10 over 4. You can't take negative 10 over 4, so it just ends up being a negative 5 over 2, or negative 2.5. So your two roots are 4 and negative 5 over 2. So that's it. That's the quadratic formula. And again, quadratic formula is something that works every single time, no matter what. You can always use it. So that's what's nice about the quadratic formula. It can take a little bit of time depending on how used you are to doing the algebra part, but once you get the hang of it, quadratic formula is nice because it always works. So make sure you get the Canvas check done for today. I will talk to you guys later. Have a great day.